My husband said, "You never worked a day in your life for all 75 years. I want a divorce." He had no idea that I had secretly been earning $500,000 a year my whole life. I nodded and signed everything without objection. He celebrated for a week, but a month later, Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Dorothy Mae Whitfield, and I was 75 years old the morning my husband of 52 years looked me in the eye across our kitchen table and told me I had never worked a day in my life. I remember the smell of the coffee. I had brewed it the same way every morning for 5 decades. 2 scoops of dark roast, a pinch of cinnamon, the way Gerald had asked me to do it back in 1971 when we were newly married and living in that little apartment in Columbus, Ohio. The morning light came through the yellow curtains I had sewn myself. The cardinal that lived in the oak tree outside was singing. Everything looked ordinary. Everything looked like home. "You never worked a day in 75 years, Gerald said, and his voice was flat, the way it gets when he has already made up his mind about something. Not a real day, not a real job. I set down my mug. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at the man I had married in the summer of 1972, the man I had nursed through 2 knee surgeries and a bout of pneumonia that nearly took him in 2014, the man I had followed from Columbus to Cincinnati to Atlanta and back again as his sales career moved us across the country like furniture. And I nodded. "All right, Gerald," I said. "But let me tell you something about Dorothy Mae Whitfield. I have never been all right about anything in my life without first understanding it completely." The trouble had not started that morning. Looking back, I can trace the first thread to about 18 months earlier, when our youngest son, Craig, moved back from Phoenix after his divorce. He was 50 years old and heartbroken, and Gerald welcomed him with an open door and a sympathetic ear, which I understood. What I did not understand was why Craig began to sit in on Gerald's phone calls, why he began to accompany Gerald to the bank on Tuesday mornings, why, when I came into the living room one evening in October, both of them went quiet in the particular way that people go quiet when they have been talking about you. I noticed, but I said nothing. That is something people have always underestimated about me. I am a noticer. By spring, there were other things. Gerald had started calling me the wife in conversations with Craig, as though I were a category rather than a person. He stopped asking my opinion about decisions that had always been made together. The investment accounts, the property taxes on the lake house in Tennessee that my own mother had left to me. He stopped, just like that, as if I had already ceased to matter. And then there was Renee. Renee Calloway was 53 years old, divorced, and had been Gerald's administrative assistant at the insurance firm where he had worked before his retirement 7 years ago. She had attended our anniversary party the previous June. She had complimented my hydrangeas and eaten 2 pieces of my lemon cake and smiled at me with the particular warmth of a woman who knows something you do not. I found her name in Gerald's phone in late January, not by snooping. I want to be clear about that. His phone lit up on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower, and the name was simply there, Renee, 9:47 p.m. I did not open the message. I did not need to. The hour was enough. I am 75 years old. I have been alive long enough to know what a 9:47 p.m. text from a woman named Renee means. So when Gerald sat across from me that Tuesday morning in March and told me he wanted a divorce and told me I had never worked, never contributed, never built anything of value in my life. I understood that the speech had been prepared. I understood that Craig had probably helped him practice it. I understood that Renee was waiting somewhere, patient as a cat outside a mouse hole. I nodded. "All right, Gerald," I said again. He slid a manila folder across the table. Inside were divorce papers, already drafted. The settlement offer was modest. It assumed quite confidently that I had no assets of my own. It assumed that I was exactly what he had described, a woman who had never worked, never saved, never planned. I picked up the pen he offered me. I signed every page. He looked surprised for just a moment, surprised that I hadn't argued, hadn't wept, hadn't thrown the coffee mug. Then the surprise faded, and something that looked very much like relief spread across his face. He celebrated that evening. I heard him on the phone with Craig, laughing. I went upstairs, sat at the small writing desk in the guest room, and opened my laptop. I had some calls to make. I had some things to arrange. Gerald had made one very serious miscalculation. He had spent 52 years assuming he knew everything about me. He did not know me at all. The guest room had been mine in all but name for the last 3 years. I had moved there gradually, the way water moves, slowly, quietly, without announcing itself. A book here, a cardigan there, my reading lamp. Eventually, the small writing desk that had belonged to my mother. Gerald had never commented on the migration. I think he had been relieved. I sat at that desk the night after I signed the papers, and I made myself look at the numbers. This is something most people do not do. Most people, when they are frightened, look away from the numbers. They make tea. They call a friend. They convince themselves that things are not as bad as they seem, or that someone will come along and fix what is broken. I have never been that kind of woman. My mother taught me that fear is only dangerous when you refuse to examine it. "Look at the thing directly," she used to say. "It always has less teeth than you imagine." I opened my personal records, not the joint accounts. Those I already knew were titled in Gerald's name, a decision we had made in 1987 for tax purposes that I had never troubled to revisit. I was looking at my own accounts, the ones Gerald did not know about because Gerald had never asked and I had never offered. Here is something I have never told anyone, not even my daughter Patricia. I began investing in 1981. It started small. I had taken in alterations and sewing work since the late 1970s when the children were young and Gerald's salary barely covered the mortgage. It was quiet work, done at the kitchen table after the children were in bed. Neighbors brought me their wedding dresses, their christening gowns, their sons' prom suits. I charged fair prices, and I saved every dollar I earned in a separate account at a separate bank. By 1981, I had $4,000 saved. A woman at my church, Harriet Boone, an accountant, suggested I put it in a mutual fund. I did. And then I kept adding to it, year after year, as the sewing business grew into something larger. I began making custom quilts that sold through a small mail-order catalog. Then, in 1994, when the internet arrived, I opened an online shop. I had a talent for it that surprised even me. The quilts sold in New York and California and London. I hired 2 women to help with the sewing. I incorporated the business quietly in 1997 under my maiden name, Dorothy May Hargrove, LLC. And I never mentioned it to Gerald, not because I was hiding it, but because Gerald had never once asked what I did with my days. By 2010, the business was turning over $400,000 a year. By 2020, closer to $600,000. I had invested conservatively and consistently for 40 years. I owned 4 properties outright. The lake house that had come from my mother, plus 3 small rental units in Cincinnati that I had purchased with my own earnings in the late 1990s. My financial advisor, a careful woman named Susan Park at a firm in Atlanta, managed a portfolio worth approximately $2.3 million. Gerald knew none of this. I sat at my desk that night and I was honest with myself about 2 things. The first was fear. Real fear, the physical kind, that settled in my chest and made my hands cold. Not fear of losing Gerald. That particular grief had already come and gone over the past 18 months as I watched him make his preparations. The fear was something older and more complicated. The fear of being seen finally after a lifetime of invisibility. The fear of what a courtroom might do with the story of a 75-year-old woman who had quietly accumulated a fortune while her husband looked through her as though she were glass. The second thing I was honest about was this. Those divorce papers I had signed were not the end. They were a first draft. Gerald's attorney had prepared them under the assumption that there were no hidden assets on my side. Under Georgia law, if that assumption held, the settlement I had signed would stand. But the settlement I had signed was the one Gerald's lawyer had prepared. It was not the one I intended to live with. I had signed those papers quickly and without argument because I needed Gerald to feel safe. I needed him to stop watching me. I needed him to celebrate with Craig and call Renee and sleep soundly, convinced that he had won before the game had properly started. Because here is what Gerald did not understand about a woman who has managed a business quietly for 40 years. She is very, very good at patience, and she is very, very good at planning. I picked up my phone and texted Susan Park. "Can we meet Thursday? I need to review everything, all accounts. I'll explain when I see you." Then I opened a second contact and typed a message to a name I had kept in my phone for 2 years, ever since Patricia had given it to me after her own divorce. A family law attorney. Sharp, Patricia had said. Expensive, worth every cent. Her name was Margaret Ossie and her office was in Buckhead. I sent the message at 11:14 p.m. She replied at 11:47. "Thursday works. 10 a.m. Bring everything." Downstairs, I could hear Gerald watching television. Some sports program, the volume too loud, the way it always was, the sound of a man completely at ease. Good, I thought. Let him be at ease. Margaret Ossie's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building off Peachtree Road, and the view from her conference room looked out over the Atlanta skyline on a clear March morning. She was in her late 40s with close-cropped natural hair and reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and she had the particular quality I most admire in a professional. She listened before she spoke. I laid everything on the table. My business incorporation documents, my personal investment records, the deeds to the 4 properties, Susan Park's most recent portfolio summary, the signed divorce papers Gerald had presented me with 6 days earlier. Margaret read without interrupting. She took notes in a small leather notebook with a green pen. When she finished, she set the papers down, removed her glasses, and looked at me directly. "Mrs. Whitfield," she said, "do you understand what you've signed?" "I signed what Gerald gave me," I said. "I signed it to make him feel certain." She was quiet for a moment. "Under Georgia law, this settlement is preliminary. It hasn't been filed with the court yet. Gerald's attorney likely submitted it last week. I can check. But there's a response window. More importantly, a significant portion of your documented assets appear to be separate property, predating the marriage or acquired independently. His attorney either didn't know about them or assumed you didn't." He assumed I didn't, I said. She allowed herself a small, precise smile. Then his assumption is going to be expensive. We spent 3 hours together that morning. By the time I left, Margaret had a full picture of my financial life, a retainer check, and a plan. She would file a formal response to the divorce petition, disclosing my assets appropriately and contesting the settlement terms. She would also initiate a review of the joint marital assets, specifically the investment accounts Gerald controlled, to determine whether any funds had been moved or liquidated in anticipation of the divorce. That last item had been Susan Park's suggestion when we met on Thursday afternoon. Susan was 55, methodical, and had managed my money with the loyalty of someone who understood exactly what it had cost me to earn it. "Dorothy," she said, spreading account statements across her desk, "look at this." She pointed to a series of withdrawals from our joint brokerage account, the one I had contributed to jointly with Gerald for 30 years. Between September and February, approximately $340,000 had been moved in increments small enough to avoid automatic reporting flags. The transfers led to an account I did not recognize. "When did this start?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "September," Susan said, "right around the time Craig moved back." So it had been planned for at least 6 months. Gerald had not simply woken up one morning and decided he wanted a new life. He and Craig had constructed this. The asset transfers, the drafted settlement papers, the calculated insult across the breakfast table, as a coordinated effort to leave me with as little as possible. I sat with that knowledge for a moment. I let it be what it was. Then I took out a notepad and asked Susan to walk me through every transaction. The following week, I did something I had been putting off out of old habit. I hired a private investigator. His name was Carl Briggs, retired Atlanta PD, recommended by Margaret. I gave him Renee Calloway's name and address and asked him to document what he could. Under Georgia law, adultery is relevant to divorce proceedings in certain circumstances. I was not interested in revenge. I was interested in the complete picture. Carl called me 12 days later. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, "I've got photographs. I've got hotel receipts from the last 14 months. I've got documentation of a joint checking account opened between Gerald Whitfield and Renee Calloway in November of last year. November, 2 months after the asset transfers began. I thanked Carl, asked him to compile everything into a formal report, and sat quietly for a minute in my car in the parking lot of the Publix on Roswell Road. A woman was loading groceries into a minivan. A child was waving at a dog. The sky was very blue and very ordinary. 14 months. Gerald had been planning this for at least 14 months. I thought about the anniversary party last June. Renee complimenting my hydrangeas, eating my lemon cake, sitting in my garden. 14 months. There was a weight to the knowing that I had expected to be heavier. Instead, what I felt was something close to clarity. Not peace, not yet, but the specific, useful feeling of a woman who finally understands the exact size and shape of the problem in front of her. I drove home. Gerald was in the garage, washing his car, the way he did every Saturday. He waved at me as I pulled in. I waved back. "Good morning, Gerald," I said. "Morning," he said. He did not ask where I had been. Margaret filed our formal response on the first Tuesday of April, and the effect was immediate. Gerald's attorney was a man named Philip Dorn, and according to Margaret, he called her office within 2 hours of receiving the filing. She described the call to me that evening, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone relaying information without editorializing, though I could hear the satisfaction underneath. He was not expecting it, she said. Specifically, he was not expecting the asset disclosure. He said, and I'm quoting, "This is a surprise." I told him it shouldn't be. The disclosure detailed everything: the business, the investment portfolio, the 4 properties. It also included a formal request for a full accounting of the joint marital assets, specifically the $340,000 in transfers that Susan Park had documented. Margaret had attached Susan's analysis as an exhibit. Gerald came home that evening and did not speak to me at dinner. He sat at the opposite end of the table. We were still living in the house, which was procedurally normal during proceedings, and ate his pot roast with the rigid silence of a man rearranging his understanding of his situation. I ate my dinner and read the newspaper. The following Saturday morning, Craig arrived at 9 o'clock. He did not knock. He had a key he had been given when he moved back from Phoenix, and he used it now with the confidence of a man who believes the house belongs to him by extension. I was in the sunroom with my coffee when I heard the front door. They both came to find me. Craig was 50 years old and had his father's build, broad-shouldered, a little soft now around the middle. And he stood in the doorway of the sunroom with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the expression I had watched him practice since he was 14. Gerald stood slightly behind him, which told me everything about who was driving this visit. "Mom," Craig said, "we need to talk about what you're doing." "I'm having my coffee," I said. "Would you like some?" "This isn't funny." His voice was tight. "Dad showed me the filing. You've been hiding money. You've been running a business without telling anyone. Do you understand what that looks like?" "I understand exactly what it looks like," I said. "It looks like a woman who worked hard and managed her finances carefully." "You made us look like fools," Gerald said from the doorway. I turned to look at him. He was wearing his old blue cardigan, the one I had bought him for Christmas in 2009. I noticed that detail, and then I let it go. "You filed divorce papers, Gerald," I said. "You filed them after moving $340,000 out of our joint accounts. You opened a bank account with Renee Calloway in November. I have the documentation on all 3 of those things. I didn't make you look like a fool. You made your own decisions." The silence that followed had a quality I recognized. It was the silence of 2 people recalculating. Craig moved first. He stepped fully into the sunroom and lowered his voice to something that was meant to sound reasonable. "Mom, listen. Dad is willing to be generous. He said he'd increase the settlement offer. You'd have the house, the car, a monthly payment. You'd be comfortable. But if you keep going with this lawyer, these filings, these accusations, it's going to get ugly. It's going to be in the courts for a year or more. Is that what you want at your age? The stress? The exposure?" The exposure. There it was. He meant the business. He meant the accounts. He meant the possibility that a courtroom would ask why I had kept my finances separate for 4 decades, and whether that could be characterized as deceptive. I set down my coffee cup. "Craig," I said, "I have a very good attorney who has advised me on exactly what I am entitled to and exactly how to proceed. I'd encourage you and your father to speak with Mr. Dorn before this conversation goes any further." "We're not leaving until we reach an understanding," Craig said. "Then I'll ask you to leave," I said. "Because this is still my home, and you don't have the right to use your key to enter it for the purpose of pressuring me." Something shifted in Craig's face. The reasonable mask slipped, just briefly, and I saw the anger underneath. He looked at his father. Gerald looked at his shoes. "You'll regret this," Craig said. "I doubt it," I said. They left. I sat in the sunroom for a long time after the front door closed. The cardinal was in the oak tree again. My coffee had gone cold. I will be honest, my hands were shaking. Not from fear exactly, or not only from fear, but from the expenditure of something, the effort of holding absolutely still while two men tried to push me. I was 75 years old, and I had just stood my ground in my own sunroom, and it had cost me something physical. I called Patricia that afternoon. "Come for the weekend," I said. "I'll tell you everything." She drove up from Savannah on Friday evening, and I spent those 4 days doing very little. I walked in the garden. I slept. I let my daughter bring me tea and sit beside me while I told her the whole story from the beginning. She cried. I did not. I was past that particular shore. On Monday morning, I called Margaret Osei and told her to proceed. Gerald's next move came not from Gerald himself, but through a mutual friend, a woman named Barbara Hutchins, who had been part of our social circle since the early 1990s. Barbara was well-meaning in the way that certain people are well-meaning, energetically, and with great confidence that they know what is best. She called me on a Wednesday morning in late April and asked if she could come for lunch. I said yes, because I had nothing to hide and because I was curious. We sat on the back porch with chicken salad sandwiches and iced tea, and Barbara looked at me with the expression of someone who has prepared a speech. "Dorothy," she said, "I've been talking to Gerald." "I assumed as much," I said. She leaned forward. "He's really struggling. He looks terrible, Dorothy. He's not sleeping. Craig says he barely eats." She paused. "He made a mistake. He knows that. But he told me to tell you. He's willing to drop all of it. Call the whole thing off, go to counseling, start fresh." I looked at the garden. The peonies were just coming in, pale pink against the brick wall my father had helped us build in 1984. "Barbara," I said, "I appreciate you coming. I know Gerald asked you to, and I know you're trying to help. But I need you to understand something. A man who spent at least 14 months planning to leave me, who moved money out of our joint accounts in anticipation, who opened a bank account with another woman, that man is not struggling because he misses me. He's struggling because the plan didn't work the way he expected." Barbara's expression flickered. "I'm not angry," I continued. "I want you to hear that clearly. I'm not a bitter woman looking for revenge. I'm a 75-year-old woman who built something quietly over 50 years and is now making sure she keeps what she earned." I picked up my iced tea. "That's all this is." Barbara drove away an hour later without having accomplished whatever she had come to accomplish. I watched her car from the front window and felt something I can only describe as settled. Like a house after a storm, when everything is still and you realize the structure held. The calls from Gerald's side went quiet after that. Margaret told me that Philip Dorn had requested a 6-week delay in proceedings, citing ongoing settlement discussions. Margaret granted 2 weeks and not a day more. In the meantime, I made 2 calls that mattered. The first was to my pastor, Reverend Gloria Simmons, at the Northside congregation I had attended for 30 years. I had been avoiding church since the separation, out of a combination of exhaustion and the particular discomfort of being the subject of other people's concern. But Gloria had known me since 1995, and when I finally called, she did not offer pity or opinions. She said, "Come Sunday, just come." I did. Afterward, she took me to lunch and sat across from me for 2 hours and simply bore witness to what I had been carrying. That is a gift that cannot be overstated. The second call was to a woman named Louise Chen, who ran a small women's financial literacy organization in Midtown Atlanta. I had donated to the organization for years, but never involved myself directly. Now I called Louise and told her I wanted to become more active. We had coffee the following Tuesday, and she introduced me to several women in their 40s, 50s, 60s, who had navigated similar situations in various forms. No two stories were identical, but there was a common thread: women who had contributed quietly, invisibly, for decades, and then found themselves at the table without credit. I began attending Louise's monthly meetings. I don't want to overstate the importance of this. I was not healed by community, and the legal process was not simplified by friendship. But there is something that changes in you when you sit in a room full of people who already understand the particular shape of your experience without you having to explain it. You stop using so much energy on the explanation. You have more left for the work, and there was still work to do. Margaret called me in the second week of May with an update on the asset tracing. Gerald's attorney had responded to our accounting request, and the response had been, in Margaret's word, incomplete. They've accounted for $210,000 of the $340,000, she said. The remaining $130,000 has been characterized as personal expenditures. They haven't provided documentation. That's not going to satisfy a judge, I said. No, Margaret said, it is not. They came on a Sunday. I know they chose Sunday deliberately. There is a softness to Sundays that people try to exploit. The cooking smells, the slower pace, the memory of how things used to be. I had a pot of vegetable soup on the stove, and the windows open to the warm May air. And when the doorbell rang, I looked out the front window and saw Gerald's car in the driveway with Craig's truck behind it. I let them in. I had decided beforehand that I would let them in because refusing entry would have felt like fear, and I was not afraid. I was clear. Gerald looked as Barbara had described, thinner, slower, with the slightly gray quality of a man who has not been sleeping. He was wearing a button-down shirt, pressed, which told me someone had prepared him for this visit. Craig was in his weekend clothes, more relaxed, which told me Craig was the one who felt confident. They sat in the living room. I brought coffee without being asked, because offering hospitality in my own home was not concession. It was simply who I was. Dorothy, Gerald began, I've been doing a lot of thinking. He spoke for about 10 minutes. It was a prepared speech, smooth in the places where he had rehearsed it, and rough in the places where the rehearsal had missed something. He talked about our history, our children, the years we had built together. He said he had made serious mistakes. He said Renee meant nothing, a phrase I found almost mathematically interesting in its inaccuracy, given the 14 months of documentation Carl Briggs had assembled. He said he wanted to find a solution that was fair to both of us. I listened without interrupting. I am a good listener. When he finished, Craig leaned forward. Mom, here's the reality. The legal process is going to drag this out for a year, maybe 2. You're 75. The stress alone. He let the sentence sit there, unfinished, which was a technique I recognized. The stress alone was meant to imply that I might not survive the proceeding, that my age made me fragile. The reality, Craig continued, is that Dad's team has found some questions about your business filings from the late 90s, some years where the income wasn't reported jointly. A tax attorney they've consulted thinks there could be liability. There it was. I looked at Craig. I looked at Gerald, who was studying the carpet. Craig, I said, I have had a CPA and a tax attorney review every filing associated with my business going back to 1981. Everything was filed correctly under my separate business entity. There is no liability. I paused. But I think you know that already. I think Mr. Dorn told you that the tax angle wasn't viable, and this is what you came up with instead. Craig's jaw tightened. You're being paranoid. I'm being accurate, I said. There's a difference. Gerald looked up from the carpet. There was something in his face that I had not expected. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of helpless frustration. The expression of a man who has discovered that the story he told himself about his wife was not the true story. For just a moment, I felt something that was almost sympathy. Then I thought about September, about the first transfer, about the careful, patient, deliberate dismantling of our shared life while I was making his coffee and sewing his grandchildren's Christmas stockings. The sympathy passed. I think this conversation is finished, I said. Craig stood up. His voice, when it came, had dropped into something cold and controlled that was, in its own way, more alarming than shouting. You are going to be very alone when this is done. Your children, your grandchildren, they're going to have to choose, and you might not like what they choose. I stood as well. I am 5'4" and 75 years old, and I looked my son in the face. My children are not a bargaining chip, I said, and if you use them as one, that will be something you have to live with, not me. They left. I sat back down in the living room after the door closed, and I will be honest with you, I was frightened. Not of the lawsuit, not of Gerald. Frightened of that last thing Craig had said, the specific vulnerability of a grandmother who would rather lose everything else than lose her grandchildren. He had found the real edge of me and pressed against it deliberately. But here is what fear did that evening. It clarified. I went upstairs and I wrote down every commitment Gerald and Craig had made to me over the years, every birthday dinner, every holiday I had organized, every crisis I had managed quietly so that no one else had to carry it. I wrote it all down, not out of bitterness, but because I needed to remind myself of what was real and what was theater. Then I called Patricia. They threatened the grandchildren, I said. Her answer was immediate and unambiguous. Let me call Thomas, she said. Thomas was our eldest. We'll handle this. The mediation was scheduled for the second Tuesday of June in a neutral conference room at a law firm on Peachtree Street that neither Margaret nor Dorn used professionally. These things are chosen carefully. The table was long, pale wood, the kind of table that is meant to feel serious without being intimidating. There was water in glass pitchers. There were yellow legal pads at each seat. There was morning light coming in from the east, clean and unhurried. I had arrived 15 minutes early, which was deliberate. I wanted to be seated when they walked in. I wanted the room to already be mine when they entered it. Gerald arrived with Philip, Dorn, and Craig. I had not expected Craig. Mediation is typically for the parties and their legal representatives, but Dorn had apparently requested his presence as family support, and Margaret had agreed with the small, precise smile that meant she had a reason for agreeing that she had not yet disclosed. I arrived with Margaret and, to Gerald's visible surprise, 2 additional people. Susan Park, my financial advisor, composed and authoritative in a navy blazer, and a man named David Whitmore, who was a forensic accountant Margaret had retained 4 weeks earlier to trace the $130,000 in personal expenditures that Gerald's team had failed to document. David Whitmore was in his late 40s, unremarkable in appearance, the kind of man you would not notice at a party. He had a leather folder and a pleasant expression, and he had spent 4 weeks following a paper trail that Gerald had assumed was invisible. Gerald looked at David Whitmore the way a man looks at something he was not prepared for. Not panic, not yet, but the particular alertness of someone recalculating. Good. The mediator was a retired judge named Honorable Patricia Okafor. Small, precise, with the patient attention of someone who has sat through thousands of human catastrophes and found in each of them a legible logic. She opened with the standard language about good faith and mutual interest and the preferability of resolution without judicial intervention. She looked at both sides of the table with the equality of someone who had long ago stopped being impressed by either money or indignation. Philip Dorn presented Gerald's revised offer first. It was meaningfully better than the original. The house in full, a larger monthly payment, a portion of the joint investment accounts. He presented it with the confidence of a man who believes he has brought a generous gift to a difficult negotiation. Under other circumstances, for a woman who truly had no independent assets, it might have seemed generous. It was the kind of offer designed to look reasonable in a courtroom if things proceeded that far. Margaret let him finish completely. She did not interrupt, did not annotate, did not signal anything. She simply listened with her hands flat on the table. Then she placed 3 documents on the table. Precisely, one at a time, the way you place cards when you already know you've won. The first was David Whitmore's forensic accounting report. The $130,000 had not been spent on personal expenditures. It had been transferred in installments, careful, measured installments, never large enough to trigger automatic scrutiny, to a personal account Gerald had opened in his name only at a credit union in Marietta, an account that had subsequently been used to make a down payment on a condominium in Renee Calloway's building. Purchased 3 months before Gerald had told me across the breakfast table that I had never worked a day in my life. Gerald's neck went red. The color started at his collar and moved upward. "That's not," he started. "The deed is in your name," David Whitmore said pleasantly. "Filed November 14th. I have the county records here if you'd like to review them." Philip Dorn wrote something on his legal pad with great concentration. He did not look up. The second document was Carl Briggs's investigative report, 14 months of documentation, hotel receipts from a Marriott in Buckhead, a Renaissance in Charleston, 3 nights at a property in Highlands, North Carolina, the previous August, which was, I noted internally, the same weekend Gerald had told me he was fishing with friends in Chattanooga. I had packed him a cooler. I had made sandwiches and wrapped them in wax paper and handed them to him at the door. He had kissed my cheek. I watched Craig read the Charleston receipt. I watched the calculation happening behind his eyes, the rapid reassessment of how much his father had told him and how much Gerald had quietly omitted from the version Craig had been given to work with. There is a particular expression that crosses a person's face when they realize they have been used as a tool without being given the full blueprint. I recognized it because I had worn it myself once, years ago, in a different context. Philip Dorn was now studying the far wall. The third document was the one Margaret had prepared last, and it was the most precise. It was a cross-reference summary of every asset I held independently, the business, the properties, the portfolio, alongside the business and tax filings, and a letter from my CPA and tax attorney confirming that every element had been reported correctly and that there was no outstanding liability of any kind. This document addressed the threat Craig and Gerald had made in my living room 3 weeks earlier. It named that threat specifically, by date and by the language used. It documented Craig's statement about my children and grandchildren being asked to choose. It documented Gerald's presence during that statement and his silence in response to it. The room was very quiet. Judge Okafor looked up from the third document. She removed her reading glasses. She looked at Dorn with the even, measured expression of a woman who has seen this particular configuration of facts before and knows exactly where it leads. "Mr. Whitfield," she said, "I'd like to give you a moment to speak with your counsel privately." They took 20 minutes. Through the conference room wall, I could hear the rise and fall of voices. Mostly Craig's, I thought, pitched too high and too fast, the voice of a person arguing with a reality that has already occurred and cannot be revised by argument. Then Gerald's voice, lower, slower, with long silences between his sentences. Then Craig again, sharper. Then silence. Margaret poured herself a glass of water and made a note in her green pen. Susan Park looked out at the Atlanta skyline. I looked at my hands on the pale table and thought about nothing in particular, which is a skill I had been practicing. When they came back, Philip Dorn looked like a man who had aged perceptibly in 20 minutes. He had the specific expression of an attorney who has discovered that his client withheld material information and who is now obligated to represent that client anyway, and who is finding this obligation professionally uncomfortable. Craig sat down without speaking. He would not look at me. "My client," Dorn said, "is prepared to discuss a revised framework." Margaret placed her hand flat on the table. "Mr. Dorn, my client isn't here to revise a framework. She's here to settle, and I have her terms in writing." She slid a document across the table with the unhurried motion of someone who has been patient long enough. "These are not opening positions. These are terms." I watched Gerald read the document. I watched his eyes move down the page, careful, slow, the way he read anything he was trying to find an argument against. I watched him reach the section on the condominium. I watched him reach the section on the joint account transfers and their complete documentation. I watched him reach the section on the independent business valuation and the proposed division of marital assets under Georgia equitable distribution law, which accounted for 52 years of contribution in every form that contribution can take. He looked up at me across the long, pale table. For the first time in months, perhaps the first time in years, he looked at me with his full attention, not through me, not past me. He looked at me the way you look at someone when you finally understand that you did not know them, and the understanding arrives too late to be useful. "Dorothy," he said. His voice had something in it that might have been, under different circumstances, the beginning of an apology. I did not close the door on it, but I did not walk through it either. "Gerald," I said quietly, "I don't need anything from you right now. I just need your signature." Craig leaned forward with one last effort. "This is extortion. This is, you've been hiding assets, you've been building a case for years." "Craig." Judge Okafor's voice was entirely calm, the way that a very large, very certain thing is calm. "You are here in a supporting capacity. Please allow your father and his counsel to proceed." Craig sat back. His hands, on the table, were trembling slightly. I noticed that and did not comment on it. The silence that followed was the longest of the morning. Gerald looked at the document. He looked at Dorn. Dorn gave him the small nod of a man advising his client to accept the reality in front of him. Gerald picked up the pen. He signed. I watched his hand move across each page. He did not rush. He did not hesitate dramatically the way people do in films. He signed with the careful, deliberate motion of a man who has decided to accept what cannot be changed and who is trying to preserve what remains of his dignity in the act of acceptance. I will give him that. It took another 6 weeks to finalize everything through the court: petitions, a judge's review, the formal dissolution hearing. But in practical terms, everything was decided in that conference room on a Tuesday morning in June when Gerald Whitfield picked up Philip Dorn's pen and signed his name to Margaret Osei's terms. I will tell you what those terms were, because specificity is how you keep the story your own. I retained full ownership of my business, Dorothy May Hargrove, LLC, and all its associated assets and future earnings, which I had always owned independently. I retained the lake house in Tennessee, which had come from my mother's estate. I retained the 3 rental properties in Cincinnati, clear of any marital claim, along with their income streams. I retained my investment portfolio in full, the product of 40 years of quiet, consistent, unglamorous work. With respect to the marital assets, the joint investment accounts, the equity in the Atlanta house, the retirement funds Gerald and I had contributed to together, we divided them according to Georgia's equitable distribution principles, which account for the contributions of both spouses in every form those contributions take. Margaret had documented my contributions carefully: 30 years of joint account deposits from my business income, 30 years of household and childcare management that had freed Gerald to travel, build his career, and be available for work dinners and fishing trips, because someone else was reliably managing everything else. The division was not equal in the strict arithmetic sense. It was equitable. There is an important difference between those two words. I also received the Atlanta house outright, in lieu of my share of the joint investment accounts. The house I had lived in for 23 years, where I had grown the hydrangeas and sewn the curtains and raised the children. That house was mine. The condominium in Renee's building, purchased with $130,000 in marital funds, documented to the last decimal point by David Whitmore, was classified as a marital asset and factored into the division accordingly. Gerald's attorney filed 2 motions to reclassify it as a personal acquisition. Judge Okafor denied both, with the brevity of someone who has already explained a thing once and does not intend to explain it again. The tax liability threat was never raised again in any professional context. My CPA's letter was part of the permanent record. The matter was closed. In the weeks following the mediation, Margaret sent a formal letter documenting the verbal exchange in my living room on the Sunday in May. Specifically, Craig's statement about my children and grandchildren being made to choose, delivered in my own home, over coffee I had made for him. The letter noted that any further contact of that nature from Craig would be treated as a matter for the court. Craig did not respond. The formal dissolution hearing lasted 45 minutes in a small carpeted room on the 4th floor of the Fulton County Courthouse. Gerald looked at the judge. I looked at the judge. Our attorneys spoke the necessary language. The judge reviewed the settlement, confirmed that both parties had signed voluntarily and with legal counsel, and approved the dissolution. She stamped the paperwork at 2:47 in the afternoon. I walked out into the July heat and stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, the way you stand when you have set down something you have been carrying for a long time and your body needs a moment to understand the new weight of itself. Margaret stood beside me. She did not say anything immediately, which I appreciated. Then she said, "You did well, Dorothy." I thought about Gerald at the breakfast table with his manila folder. I thought about Craig in the sunroom with his arms crossed. I thought about Renee's name on a phone screen at 9:47 on a cold January night. I thought about every hour at the writing desk in the guest room, building the case document by document, with the patience of a woman who had learned that the work that lasts is always done quietly. I did what needed doing, I said. We walked to the parking garage in the July afternoon, and the city went on around us, indifferent and enormous. I felt, not triumphant, not vindicated, though I was both. I felt free, entirely and completely free, the kind that doesn't announce itself. That just settles into your bones like good weather and stays. I turned 76 in October, and Patricia threw me a party in the garden. She strung lights in the oak tree and the hydrangea bushes, and my grandchildren ran through the yard in the warm fall evening, while Reverend Gloria Simmons laughed at something Louise Chen said about Atlanta traffic. Thomas was there with his family, and my oldest granddaughter Emma sat beside me and said, "Grandma, you're kind of a legend." I told Emma that I preferred the word practical. The months after the divorce had a quality of expansion, the way a room feels larger when the furniture is rearranged. I redecorated the house, not dramatically, but because it was mine now in a way it hadn't been before. I kept the yellow curtains. I changed almost everything else. I became more involved with Louise's organization. In January, I gave a practical talk on business registration and financial separation to a room of 40 women. 6 of them came to speak to me afterward. I ended up speaking at 4 more events that year. The Cincinnati rental properties I handed to a management firm, freeing up time and attention. My quilt business continued strong. A new spring line sold better than anything in years. Susan and I built a solid 5-year financial plan, and I felt genuinely in control of my future for the first time in a long time. I was not lonely. The loneliness I had feared never arrived. What came instead was peace in my own company, something 52 years of marriage had left no room for. I drove alone to Tennessee in April, opened the lake house, and sat on the dock all morning watching the water without speaking to anyone. It was one of the finest mornings of my life. As for Gerald and Craig, I heard things, as one does. Gerald and Renee moved in together by August. By November, mutual friends called the relationship complicated. She was 53 with her own retirement expectations. He was 77, humbled, living on less than anticipated. These things rarely combine smoothly. Craig was 50, working a sales job that wasn't going well. His relationship with Thomas had cooled after the mediation, once Thomas understood the full picture. Craig had expected family solidarity. He received quiet judgment instead. I did not gloat. When I thought of them, I felt something closer to sorrow, not for myself, but for the waste of it all. I didn't carry their story. I had my own, and it was a good one. They are wrong. Here's what I learned. Invisibility is not weakness. Patience is not surrender. And the woman who keeps her records always outlasts the man who keeps his assumptions. So tell me, if someone looked at your life and said it counted for nothing, what would you do? Think carefully. Thank you for listening from the bottom of my heart. Dorothy.